from Houston up to the new city of Austin, which would replace Waterloo, and Congress was going to meet in October of 1839. Now, of course, Sam Houston had fought this tooth and nail, and all of his allies had fought it. They cried foul and fraud, and they thought it was very unfair. And there were a lot of people that came here very reluctantly. The first thing they needed to do was build a city. There was nothing here, except for those few cabins that those families were living in. And Mirabeau Lamar made an excellent choice in hiring a guy named Edwin Waller of Waller Creek, in Waller, Texas fame, to head up the effort to get the men up here and the materials up here to build this city in 5 months. And it was a great choice because he did an outstanding job. I mean, he actually did have everything ready as much as was possible. He was scrupulously honest. He kept very detailed books, and he made a good profit. I mean, he was paid a good salary for what he did, but he did it very honestly, and he did a very excellent job. And I think Austin owes him a lot. He actually became the first mayor of Austin. So that in the fall of 1839, Congress showed up, and indeed there was a Capitol building. It was a big wooden building. All these structures were meant to be temporary because you had to throw them up in a hurry. And the Capitol was at about 8th and Colorado. The presidential mansion was over on the other side of town, and the reason he picked these two spots is, back then, you could see the topography of the land. Congress Avenue was kind of a ravine that ran up from the river up above 4th Street. If you walk along Congress now, it's flat on either side by the river, but as you get up above 4th Street and look to either side, you're looking uphill. And you don't realize that in a modern city, but about 8th Street, where he shot that buffalo, it's a pretty steep hill. And so he put the presidential mansion on the big hill on the east side of that ravine, and the Capitol on the big hill on the west side of that ravine. And then his initial plan was to put the permanent Capitol situated right in the middle of a big square grid of streets. But he saw that big hill that Lamar had climbed and looked down the river from, and he said, that's where the Capitol needs to be, and then we'll put the city below that. And so this 15-block square was built just below that hill with the idea that eventually the permanent Capitol would be on a big hill, which it is. It ran from the river up to 15th Street, which then was called North Avenue, West Avenue, which is still called West Avenue on the west side, and then East Avenue, which now is mostly I-35. And that was the original city of Austin. And then once the government was here, Sam Houston, first thing he did, he was now the representative from St. Augustine County, and he right away tried to pull government back out of Austin. They managed to suppress that pretty quickly, and then Lamar got on with his big challenge, which was to send an expedition to Santa Fe and convince the Santa Fe people to join Texas. And his idea was to send a trade mission. And just coincidentally, there'd be about 100 guys going along with rifles. But the idea was to bring all these goods over there and say, hey, look, we want to start this trade, and it's going to be good for us. And by the way, now most of the people along on the mission didn't know this, but Lamar sent along a letter inviting them to tell Mexico to go take a hike and join with the Republic of Texas. Turns out that Santa Fe is more than 400 miles away. Turns out that there's no road signs back in 1840 or 41, whenever they went along on this trip. Nobody had thought to ask the Comanche and Kiowa Indians what they thought about this idea, and it turns out they were against it. And as it also turns out that most of the people of Santa Fe either didn't care one way or the other, or were loyal to Mexico. And that included the governor of Mexico, a guy named Armijo. By the time the Texans, they got lost. They were going to go up to the Red River and then turn west and follow that over to New Mexico. They ended up on a different river, and they were who knows where they were. It took them longer than they thought. They didn't bring enough food. They lost several men to starvation and thirst and Indian attack. And by the time they got there, they were actually split into a couple different bands. They were exhausted, and the Mexicans captured them without a fight and marched all these guys down to San Antonio and stuck them in a dungeon. So it was a total fiasco. It cost a lot of people a lot of money. Lamar had sort of pushed this through Congress. Congress had actually not authorized any money for this trip, and I'm not sure where he found the money, but a lot of it was invested privately. And so a lot of people were very upset with this by the time he left Austin. Who succeeded him? Sam Houston. Sam Houston had defeated Lamar's Vice President David Burnett in a particularly nasty presidential race in which Burnett and his supporters repeatedly accused Houston of claiming that he was going to desolate the city of Austin once he came into office. And Houston denied this, and with the claim that, hey, you know, we've already spent all this money to put it up there, I've lost, I said my piece, and I'm just going to leave it alone. Which maybe that was true. But very shortly after he took office, Mexico, with whom we were technically still at war, sent an invading army up to San Antonio. And it didn't stay more than a day or two before turning around going back to Rio Grande. But Sam Houston said, this is what I've been telling you guys. It's too exposed, it's too far out on the frontier. If they had come into, you know, if they had come just a few miles further north, they could have easily had the capital of the country and destroyed all the archives. And the archives they were particularly worried about were the land office records. Because if those were destroyed, suddenly nobody knows who owns what land, and that's the whole reason everybody back in those days came to Texas. So it would have been utter chaos. And that's what Sam Houston said he was trying to prevent. But he couldn't convince anybody to do anything about it. A month later, Mexico sent another army up to San Antonio. This time it stayed for about a week until a force of Texans was able to lure them out to battle on Salado Creek east of town, inflicted a defeat on them, and the Mexicans went back to the Rio Grande River again. But Sam Houston said, okay, twice is enough. And he ordered government to leave Austin, and he ordered Congress, you know, all the departments had to leave Austin, and he ordered Congress to reconvene down in the city of Houston because that's where the buildings were that they could meet in. Nobody would go to Houston, at least the congressmen. Not enough went, couldn't raise a quorum. The department heads followed orders and left town with their records, all except one, which we'll get to. But because he couldn't raise a quorum for Congress, he said, okay, well, let's go to Washington on the Brazos. And they had still some of the meeting halls up there, and that's where government went. The people of Austin were furious about this. They thought it cowardly. You know, they said, hey, we can whip 10 times the number of Mexicans that come up this way. That's how people thought back in those days. And we've already, you know, we went down there and beat them, and they left. So the archives are perfectly safe with us. They formed an archives committee composed of the people of Austin and Bastrop, who were also interested in keeping government out here. And they started patrolling the two main roads leading out of Austin, the main one being between here and Bastrop. And they stopped any wagon coming out of Austin and searched it to make sure that the land office records stayed right in the city. Everything else left. The land office stayed. By then, the guy in charge of the land office was Thomas William Ward, the guy that built the Capitol down in Houston. Thomas William Ward, also known as Peg Leg Ward, is an interesting character. There's a really good biography that's out about him that you can read. And he was called Peg Leg because at the siege of Bexar in 1835, he lost a leg to a cannonball. And then around 1839, 1840, up in Austin, he was loading a cannon for a San Jacinto Day celebration, and the cannon went off and blew his arm off. So, I don't think he called him Peg Leg to his face, but that's what everybody referred to him as. And he's in charge of the land office. And he was a very brilliant guy, and obviously he had he was tough, and yet he was a drinker and a brawler, and probably beat his wife too, which was written in his biography. So he was a character, and he's the guy in charge of the land office. He took the opinion, he was of the opinion that I have a legal order from the president, and I should be allowed to take these records, and these people of Austin are basically traitors. And that's what Sam Houston said too. The people of Austin, guess what? They didn't care. Call me whatever you want, we're keeping the land records here. And the reason they were so intent on it was they realized that if the land records left, there was a very real chance the government was never coming back to Austin. Within a few weeks, the population of Austin plummeted from close to 1,000 to about 200, because not only government left, but all of the people that were surviving by selling things to government officials had to leave. And there weren't very many people left. Within a very short time, there were cattle roaming all over the place. Up into the Capitol was deserted. One person that came through town described the Capitol as a building, a refuge for stray cattle and bats. Another time, a herd of buffalo wandered right up Congress Avenue, you know, because there just was no activity here. So it was a very real fear, and they were afraid that government wouldn't come back. So Sam Houston was intent on still pulling things out. He sent two guys over here in 1841 named John Hall and Buck Pettis with instructions to get those records from the land office and haul them up to Washington. These guys didn't play it very smooth. They showed up in town, and in plain view of everybody, loaded the records onto a wagon. And by then it was getting dark, and there was a saloon right there, so, you know, let's go get plastered and we can take care of the rest of this in the morning. When they came out on the porch of their hotel in the morning, there's a mob of angry Austinites. And in the middle of this mob is, and most of them are carrying weapons, and in the middle of this mob is a cannon pointed right at them. And John Hall tried to bluff it out. Buck Pettis said, I know some of these folks, they'll shoot. So they left, and they left the records there. And they probably were right. They probably would have shot. And Sam Houston, you know, very mad. He laid low for a while. And then in December, he picked two more guys, Eli Chandler and Thomas Smith, and he said, let's be a little smarter about it this time. Raise a force of about 20 men, but don't tell them what the plan is. Tell them that you're going to go out there and patrol for Indians and fight Indians. And then go into town, get these records, and, you know, kind of be sneaky about it. Don't do it so openly like the other two guys did. So on December 31st, 1841, they rolled into town, but just before they rolled into town, somebody had rung the Indian alarm bell on Congress Avenue. Don't know for sure who, but I have to believe it was one of the men of this group, because very conveniently, all of the armed men of Austin left town to go ride around the countryside, look for these Indians that supposedly were out there. Everybody that was left, which was mostly women and children, with a few older men, and at least one man, Dennis Walsh, who was younger but was on crutches from a broken leg, they gathered down at 6th and Congress in Bullock's Hotel. Richard Bullock's Hotel, also referred to as Bullock's Fort. The reason it was called Bullock's Fort was it was about the biggest building in town. It had several outbuildings. It was really a compound of buildings, and it was a relatively safe place to go, and that's where people tended to congregate. And it was right in the center of town, too, so it was easiest for everybody to get there. Well, they're down there at Bullock's Fort, and they look up the street at the land office, which was about 8th and Congress, and they see some wagons pull into town with about 20 armed riders. And these guys start hauling boxes out of the land office. And, you know, they're suspicious, so a physician named Joseph Robertson wandered up the street and said, hey guys, what are you up to? And they said, none of your damn business, get back down there before there's trouble. Well, he went back down to where these people were, and they asked him what was up, and he said, I'm sure they're loading the records, but there's really nothing we can do about it. Well, there was a woman named Angelina Everly, you may have heard of. She was a tough old bird, and she started shaming these men that were there. And she pointed across the street to a shed where they kept the cannon that was used for protection against Indian attack. And she said, what's that cannon for, guys? And so they said, okay. And they trudged across the street and they hauled the cannon out. Meanwhile, she supposedly ran into Bullock's and came out with a torch of some type. And she took a look at the cannon, decided it wasn't aimed right, gave it a shove to the right, and then lit the torch and sent around a grape shot up towards the land office. And this grape shot slammed into the building. If you don't know what grape shot is, it's like a shotgun blast. It's not a single cannonball. It's just dozens, if not hundreds, of pieces of scrap metal that are sent up that way. It's amazing that nobody was hurt. But it did hit the land office. Thomas William Ward was inside, and he heard this. And he also heard somebody shout, blow the old house to pieces. And he came running out, or limping out. And I think this sort of hastened the departure of the crew. By then they were just about finished. The only part of the story I'm not completely sure of, the legend is that Angelina Everly actually fired this cannon. I find it a little hard to believe that a bunch of he-men Texans in 1841 would stand around and let a woman fire their cannon. But on the other hand, if you know enough about Angelina Everly, it just might have happened. I heard ex-mayor Wynn give a talk about the Archives War one time, and he jokes that, yeah, she probably lit it with a cigar. Which may have been true. Anyway, the guys leave town with the records. The men out looking for Indians heard the cannon shot go off. They rushed back into town. There's chaos for a while, and then they organize a pursuit party under the leadership of a man named Mark Lewis. And they hitched that cannon up to a horse, and they took that along with them, and they took off after these guys. Now the guys that had the records didn't go out the main road towards Bastrop. They thought they would be sneaky and go by the less used road up towards Brushy Creek. There's an old fort that was in ruins up there called Kinney's Fort, right on the creek. And so they had headed up there, but the Austin guys were onto them, and they took off after them. It's getting dark by now. It was a cold, rainy, sleety night, but they trudged through, and they caught up to him at Kinney's Fort and set up camp around him. So that the next morning, when Thomas Smith and Eli Chandler got up, you can imagine their surprise and shock to see that same damn cannon aimed right at them, and all these guys holding guns. And they pull out, hey, we got a letter from the president, and they said, we don't care. And about that time, Smith and Chandler's men said, we signed up to fight Indians, not those guys. So you're on your own. And they realized they were sunk, and they gave in. And the records, they tried to make them drive the records back to Austin. They said, no, we're going to let you do that. But the records did come back. They had a big celebration once they got back to town, kind of an impromptu barbecue, and they buried the land office records. They wouldn't give them back to Peg Leg Ward, which he was very mad about. They buried them in Angelina Everly's backyard. So the rest of the story is that Anson Jones succeeded Sam Houston as president. He had kind of kept his cards close to his chest on what he thought about government being in Austin. He didn't like the fact that it was moved there to begin with, but he said, again, we've sunk all these resources into it. It would be throwing money away to do that again and move it elsewhere. Washington was certainly not much better than Austin in the first place, so that when Texas became a state in 1845, Anson Jones said, okay, the first state Congress will meet in the city of Austin. And once they met, one of the first things they did was pass a law saying that in 1850 there would be a statewide election on where to put the capital for the next 20 years. And in 1870 there would be a final election that would decide it for all time. Austin won the 1850 election. The 1870 election was delayed 2 years because of the Civil War. And in 1872 we beat out Waco. And it's interesting that the Republic of Texas had multiple capitals, 8 or 9 if I'm not mistaken. The state of Texas has had one, and that's the city of Austin. So let me show you a few pictures. Is it going?